Marijuana, weed, grass, cannabis, whatever you call it, it has been cultivated and used in the United States since at least 1600. Jamestown colonizers grew it for the strong hemp fiber used to make rope, sails, and clothing. In the 19th century, cannabis plantations spread throughout Mississippi, Georgia, California, South Carolina, Nebraska, New York, and Kentucky. Phew, that's a lot of weed and a lot of cash. How did we go from that to outlawing and policing cannabis and back again? In this short video, I'm going to take you on a tour of cannabis in Maryland, with a focus on why it was outlawed, how it was legalized, and what differences that legalization is making for our state and city. First, some definitions. Hemp, CBD, and marijuana all come from the same plant. Hemp is the fiber of the plant, and CBD and THC is the stuff that gets you high, are both cannabinoids located in the flower of the female plant. Cannabinoids interact with receptors in our bodies to affect functions like appetite, depression, pain, and more. CBD products with less than 0.3% THC are legal in many states. Some, though, still police it as a Schedule I drug. As I'll discuss in this video, labeling something a drug to be policed is a social decision, and those decisions have changed a lot since people started growing in Jamestown. In the 17th century, what would become the United States encouraged the growing of hemp, and it was even used as a currency in some areas. In 1619, the Virginia Assembly required all farmers to grow hemp. Required, a far cry from today. Marijuana didn't become popular as an ingredient in medicines and sold openly in pharmacies until the late 19th century. In 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act required labeling any medicine containing cannabis, but it didn't outlaw it. Recreational use picked up in the early 20th century. The U.S. blamed Mexican immigrants, alleging that the problems with weed were caused after the Mexican Revolution of 1910, when immigrants brought it with them into the U.S. Anti-drug campaigners blamed Spanish-speaking newcomers and wrongly attributed crimes to the drug and the Mexican people who used it. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? During the Depression in the 1930s, unemployment and economic unrest heightened anti-immigrant sentiment, and, quote, research was used to show that communities deemed racially inferior or lower class were blamed for the widespread use of cannabis and increasingly policed. 29 states had outlawed it by 1931. Representations of the drug in films like Reefer Madness suggested that marijuana was responsible for a wide range of social and economic ills, ideologically supporting material efforts to ban and criminalize cannabis. But why? What was it about weed that made it the scapegoat for larger social, political, and economic issues? What problems would outlawing a substance or a practice, a behavior, an identity supposedly solve? That is always my critical question. Hemp dodged criminalization, for example, largely because of its importance as a fiber to the war industries of the 1940s. War, good; immigration, bad. It is more than this, but it is also this. In the 1950s, federal laws finally banned the drug and set mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for it and other drugs as part of the Narcotics Control Act of 1956. A first offense meant 2 to 10 years in prison and a $20,000 fine. Counterculture movements in the 60s and 70s saw marijuana use become widespread as attitudes toward it loosened, and research showed that marijuana use was not correlated with increased violence, nor was it a gateway drug. This liberalization lasted until the drug wars of the 1980s. Those drug wars attacked not just substances, but the people imagined to be using them. Drug use is consistent across social groups, but enforcement sure isn't, and that is especially true in Maryland. By 2010, Maryland had the 5th highest arrest rate for marijuana possession in the nation. Those arrests made up nearly half the arrests for drug possession in the state. Black people were 3 times more likely than white people to be arrested for marijuana possession. What problem was being solved with all these arrests? How does a plant go from being regularly used to enhance mood and sleep to being responsible for putting huge numbers of people in jail? Just as in the early days, the social decision to police the drug was about a whole lot more than the drug itself. Maryland's decriminalization and legalization movement started for recreational cannabis in 2014, when then Governor Martin O'Malley signed a law to decriminalize possession of 10 grams or less. In 2016, the General Assembly decriminalized possession of paraphernalia like rolling papers, bongs, and pipes, and decriminalized smoking marijuana in public. In 2019, our State Court of Appeals ruled that the smell of cannabis and/or possession of 10 grams or less was not sufficient probable cause for a police search. This was a sea change. Legislation legalizing medical cannabis passed in 2013, but it took a lot longer for patients to access it. The Maryland Medical Cannabis Commission, MMCC, began operating in 2017, and access was provided only to those who experienced a short list of medical conditions and had clearance from a medical professional. Why did it take so long? Creating an infrastructure to issue licenses to grow, process, and dispense the stuff legally took a long time, especially when there was a cap of only 94 dispensary licenses in the state, 2 per state Senate district, and they promised to bring in big bucks. Licenses are indeed big business. Cannabis growing and selling can bring in a lot of money, and the question of who gets to make it is a big one. Should communities most hurt by the decades of policing the drug get priority? But then why did so many early licenses go to those with political connections even when the selection process was allegedly blinded? Maryland would attempt to, quote, fix this when licensing recreational cannabis. Recreational cannabis use was legalized in 2023 following voter support in 2022 and legislative action in 23. Taxed at 9%, recreational cannabis sales bring in big money for the state. The Cannabis Business Assistance Fund was set up to support equity initiatives targeting those communities most affected by past criminalization. The bill also allowed for the expungement of criminal records for marijuana possession. Expungement is only automatic for those with a single charge for possession. Everybody else needs to fill out paperwork and bring it to the court where they were charged. MMCC is now the Maryland Cannabis Administration, and they are still building the administrative apparatus to ensure the equitable distribution of licenses and to regulate the industry. It is a big job. As I said at the start of this video, cannabis is big business. In the first month of recreational legalization, cannabis brought in over $85 million, and that number keeps growing. Criminalization costs so much, and efforts to make the new industry equitable face strong headwinds as multi-state big cannabis companies enter the market and squeeze out the little guys. I have barely scraped the iceberg that is the history and present of cannabis criminalization and legalization. I am reminded that our Constitution has only 27 amendments, and 2 of them are about the legality of alcohol. Arguments about substance use are always about more than their use, and I keep this in mind when I think about the legalization or not of cannabis and other drugs. How can we keep the same communities from continually cashing in while exploiting others? This story is far from over.